Misuse of power frequently operates in secrecy, yet karmic retribution often carries the insignia of federal authority. When a self-important, bigoted officer physically attacked a vulnerable 72-year-old grandfather driven by wounded pride, he believed himself to be beyond consequence. He was profoundly mistaken, as that elderly man's son held a position within the FBI. The oppressive humidity of Oakage, Georgia, clung heavily to the air, pressing down upon the parched asphalt like a sodden wool blanket. It was a Tuesday evening, just after twilight, when 72-year-old Theodore Hayes ambled along the tranquil suburban pavement. Theodore was a man of quiet dignity, a retired high school history instructor. He walked with a noticeable gait impediment, a memento from a serious fall decades earlier, leaning heavily on a gleaming hickory walking stick. In his free hand, he carried a modest plastic bag containing a carton of milk, a loaf of bread, and a can of peaches. He was simply a gentleman returning to his residence. 2 blocks away, Officer Bradley Jenkins was circulating in his patrol vehicle, his window lowered, the radio emitting a soft hum. Jenkins, aged 34, was sturdily built and possessed a reputation that the Oakage Police Department actively endeavored to disregard. He was a man who perceived his badge not as a safeguard for the populace, but as a crown. Throughout his 8 years of service, Jenkins had amassed a dozen complaints concerning excessive force, primarily from minority citizens, all of which had been discreetly suppressed by a complacent precinct captain who prioritized departmental solidarity over accountability. Jenkins observed Theodore commencing his crossing at the intersection of Maple and 4th Street. The streetlights flickered, casting elongated, wavering shadows. Theodore was proceeding at a slow pace, his cane tapping a rhythmic beat against the concrete. He had strayed slightly beyond the faded white demarcation lines of the pedestrian crossing. It was an infraction so trivial that a standard officer would have overlooked it entirely. However, Jenkins was experiencing boredom, agitated by the heat, and was seeking an individual upon whom to impose his authority. The patrol car accelerated, its tires emitting a faint squeal before veering aggressively towards the curb, obstructing Theodore's path. The sudden illumination of the red and blue emergency lights highlighted the elder man's time-worn features. "Hold up there, Pops!" Jenkins bellowed, exiting his vehicle. He left the door ajar, his hand resting heavily upon his duty belt. A textbook display of intimidation. Theodore halted, his countenance serene. "Good evening, officer. Is there an issue?" "You're crossing outside the designated area," Jenkins declared, his tone laced with disdain. He diminished the distance between them, looming over the elderly gentleman. "Let me see some identification." "Crossing outside the designated area?" Theodore inquired, his voice steady, though a hint of bewilderment flickered in his eyes. "The street is completely vacant, officer, and I'm merely walking to my home just around the bend." "I didn't request a discussion. I requested your identification," Jenkins snapped, stepping directly into Theodore's personal space. "Or do you have a problem adhering to straightforward legal directives?" Theodore exhaled softly, cognizant of the unwritten protocols of this deeply unjust situation. He transferred the plastic grocery receptacle to the hand holding his cane and reached into his rear pocket for his wallet. Due to his arthritic condition, his fingers were stiff. As he withdrew the leather wallet, it slipped from his grasp, descending onto the asphalt near Jenkins's substantial black boots. Instinctively, Theodore stooped to retrieve it. "Hey, keep your hands where I can see them," Jenkins commanded, his voice abruptly sharp, fabricating a threat where none existed. "I am merely retrieving my wallet, officer," Theodore stated, looking upward, his hand still hovering over the fallen leather. "I said stand up," Jenkins roared. Before Theodore could fully straighten his ailing back, Jenkins lunged. The officer made no move to deploy his handcuffs. He eschewed a conventional restraint maneuver propelled by a volatile confluence of racial prejudice and a fragile, wounded ego. Jenkins drew back his hand and delivered a savage, open-handed blow across Theodore's face. The impact of flesh against flesh resounded like a whip crack in the hushed evening. The sheer force of the strike lifted Theodore off his feet. He collided heavily with the unforgiving pavement. His hickory cane clattered into the drainage ditch. The plastic bag ruptured, sending the can of peaches rolling down the inclined street. Theodore's head struck the ground, his vision blurring in a disorienting haze of agony and shock. A jagged laceration opened on his cheekbone, blood instantly welling and mingling with the perspiration on his face. "Stop resisting," Jenkins yelled, performing for the camera affixed to his chest. A camera he was well aware he had conveniently neglected to activate. He roughly seized Theodore's arm, twisting it painfully behind the elder man's back, pressing his knee into the base of Theodore's spine. "I am not resisting," Theodore gasped, his chest heaving against the heated concrete. "I am 72 years old. You assumed a defensive posture." Jenkins fabricated his account. He secured the metallic restraint snugly around Theodore's delicate wrists, digging the metal into his skin. "You are under arrest for assaulting a police officer and resisting arrest." Across the thoroughfare, partially concealed by a venerable oak tree, 22-year-old Chloe Bennett stood paralyzed with apprehension. She had been walking her golden retriever when the patrol car swerved onto the curb, her body trembling. She had instinctively produced her smartphone and initiated recording. She had not captured the initial exchange, but she had recorded the physical assault. She had captured the brutal takedown of a frail, elderly black man who was merely reaching for his dropped wallet. Horrified, she retreated into the shadows, clutching her phone to her chest. Understanding precisely what she had just witnessed, Theodore was hauled to his feet, groaning in torment as his compromised hip flared with excruciating pain. Jenkins shoved him into the rear of the patrol car, treating him as a violent offender rather than a bleeding senior citizen. The night at the 42nd Precinct was a calculated demonstration of humiliation. Theodore was processed, photographed, and divested of his belt and shoelaces. The desk sergeant, an older gentleman named Polson, scarcely glanced at the bleeding contusion on Theodore's face, blindly accepting Jenkins' fabricated report that the suspect had stumbled and fallen while aggressively resisting. Confined to a cold concrete holding cell, redolent with the scent of stale urine and disinfectant, Theodore sat upon a rigid metal bench. His cheek throbbed, his wrists ached, and his heart beat with a heavy, sorrowful rhythm. He was offered a telephone call. He contemplated the battered wall phone for an extended period. He could contact his son, but his son, Nathaniel, was not just any son. Supervisory Special Agent Nathaniel Hayes was a rising luminary within the Federal Bureau of Investigation, operating from the Washington, D.C. field office. Nathaniel was presently immersed in a demanding, high-stakes public corruption investigation involving federal contractors. Theodore, fiercely independent and stubbornly protective of his son's demanding career, made a decision. He would not impose this burden upon Nathaniel. He would confront the indignity of the local judicial system on his own. He had weathered the civil rights struggles of the 1960s. He reasoned he could endure the arrogance of Officer Bradley Jenkins. He contacted his neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, requesting that she secure his residence and attend to his feline companion. He divulged nothing of the assault, merely that there had been a misunderstanding with the authorities. Dawn broke over Oakage, bringing with it the stifling heat and the grim reality of the municipal court proceedings. Theodore was presented before Judge Harrison Caldwell for arraignment. Judge Caldwell was a man perpetually disengaged by his profession, viewing the ceaseless procession of defendants as a vexation that encroached upon his golf engagements. Theodore was assigned a public defender, Gregory Flynn, a disheveled young attorney whose briefcase overflowed with manila folders. Flynn conferred with Theodore for precisely 4 minutes in a confined anteroom prior to the hearing. "Mr. Hayes," Flynn stated, rapidly perusing the police report, "Officer Jenkins alleges that you became belligerent, adopted a defensive posture, and attempted to strike him. You are facing a charge of assault on a law enforcement officer. That is a felony, but—" Flynn leaned closer, lowering his voice. "The prosecutor, Thomas Harding, is amenable to a resolution if you plead guilty to a misdemeanor charge of disorderly conduct. They will drop the felony, you pay a fine, undergo 6 months of probation, and you depart today." Theodore regarded the young attorney, his eyes alight with a quiet, undeniable intensity. The contusion on his cheek was sealed with a butterfly bandage applied by a reluctant detention nurse. "I am a retired educator, Mr. Flynn," Theodore enunciated, his voice resonating with profound depth. "I've dedicated my life to teaching history. I am acutely aware of the consequences when innocent men confess guilt to the transgressions of their oppressors to facilitate the smooth operation of the system. I did not adopt a defensive posture. I dropped my wallet. He struck me. I will not plead guilty to falsehood." Flynn sighed, rubbing his temples. "Mr. Hayes, it is your word against that of a decorated police officer. In this town, in Judge Caldwell's courtroom, you will be unsuccessful. Should you proceed to trial and be convicted of the felony charge, you will perish in a state penitentiary." "Then let it be so, speaking the truth," Theodore responded firmly. Reluctantly, Flynn entered a plea of not guilty. Judge Caldwell, visibly exasperated by the refusal to accept the plea agreement, set bail at an exorbitant $50,000. Theodore was unable to meet the sum. He was transferred to the county detention facility, held pending trial. What neither Theodore nor Officer Jenkins nor the Oakage Police Department comprehended was that the mechanisms of absolute justice were already in motion. When Mrs. Henderson arrived at Theodore's residence to tend to his cat, she encountered a visibly anxious young woman on the front porch. It was Chloe Bennett. Chloe had endured a sleepless night, wrestling with the video footage on her phone. She was aware of the local police force's notoriety and harbored profound fear of reprisal should she approach the local precinct. Upon seeing Mrs. Henderson, she broke down and presented the recording. Mrs. Henderson, a woman who had known Theodore for 40 years, did not hesitate. She did not contact the local authorities. She entered Theodore's study, located his personal address directory, and dialed a number in Washington, D.C., 300 miles away, within a sterile, glass-enclosed office at the J. Edgar Hoover Building. Special Agent Nathaniel Hayes answered his mobile phone. Nathaniel was a man of imposing physique, standing 6 feet 3 inches, with sharp, analytical eyes and an intellect honed to dismantle systemic corruption. He listened to Mrs. Henderson in silence. He received the video file that Chloe Bennett had forwarded. Nathaniel settled at his desk, viewing the footage on his high-resolution monitor. He observed the man who had raised him, the man who had worked dual jobs to finance his legal education and his subsequent entry into the academy, being struck down like an animal by a swaggering thug in uniform. The silence in Nathaniel's office was palpable. He did not erupt in anger. He did not destroy anything. He simply picked up his secure desk line and made 3 calls. The first was to the director of the FBI. The second was to the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division. The third was to a contingent of elite federal investigators stationed in Atlanta. The trial of Theodore Hayes was expedited, a common tactic in Oakage designed to overwhelm defendants before they could mount a substantial defense. 2 weeks later, the municipal courthouse was packed. Officer Bradley Jenkins occupied a seat at the prosecution table, impeccably attired in his pressed service uniform. He radiated an aura of supreme self-assurance, occasionally exchanging whispered remarks and chuckles with Prosecutor Harding. Jenkins had performed this routine countless times. He knew precisely what to articulate, how to project sincerity, and how to portray himself as the victim of a perilous suspect. Theodore sat beside the perspiring Gregory Flynn. The elder gentleman appeared thinner, the 2 weeks of county incarceration visibly impacting his well-being, yet his posture remained resolutely upright. Prosecutor Harding called Jenkins to the witness stand. Jenkins swore an oath upon a Bible, settling comfortably in the witness box. "Officer Jenkins," Harding commenced smoothly, "could you elucidate the events of the evening of July 14th? "Yes, sir," Jenkins replied, his voice carrying clearly across the wood-paneled chamber. "I observed the defendant crossing the street unlawfully. When I initiated a lawful stop to issue a warning, the defendant immediately became hostile. He uttered obscenities. When I requested his identification, he suddenly lunged toward his midsection. Fearing he was reaching for a weapon, I ordered him to desist. He then adopted a combative stance and advanced aggressively towards me. I was compelled to employ an open-handed strike to neutralize the immediate threat to my safety." It was a perfectly rehearsed fabrication, seamless and airtight. Flynn stood for cross-examination, but he was entirely outmatched. "Officer Jenkins, is it not true, sir, that Mr. Hayes was merely reaching for his dropped wallet?" "No, sir. I did not perceive a wallet until after the suspect had been subdued." Jenkins lied smoothly, his countenance a mask of professional integrity. Judge Caldwell consulted his timepiece, leaning over the bench. "Mr. Flynn, do you possess any concrete evidence to refute the officer's sworn testimony, or are we merely going to squander the court's afternoon?" Flynn swallowed hard, glancing at Theodore. "No further questions, Your Honor." Jenkins descended from the stand, a faint, triumphant smirk playing on his lips as he passed Theodore. The prosecution rested. "Mr. Flynn," Judge Caldwell sighed heavily, "will you be calling any witnesses for the defense?" Flynn stood, his hands trembling slightly. He was preparing to present Theodore, fully aware that the prosecutor would dismantle the elderly gentleman. "Your Honor," the defense calls. Bang! The formidable, solid oak doors at the rear of the courtroom did not merely open, they were violently forced inward. The resonant sound reverberated off the high ceilings, instantly silencing the chamber. Judge Caldwell's gavel paused mid-swing. Jenkins snapped his head around, his hand instinctively dropping to his empty holster. Standing in the doorway was Special Agent Nathaniel Hayes. He was accompanied by 4 men in dark suits. Their lapels bore the unmistakable gold and blue enamel pins of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Nathaniel wore a tailored charcoal suit that barely concealed the muscular tension beneath. His federal badge was prominently clipped to his belt, catching the fluorescent light. His expression was not that of a victor. It was the cold, unyielding countenance of federal justice. Behind Nathaniel stood Chloe Bennett, trembling but resolute, and a federal prosecutor from the Department of Justice. The courtroom descended into an absolute, suffocating silence. The air seemed to congeal. The local bailiffs stood frozen, uncertain of their next move. Nathaniel did not await permission to enter. He strode down the central aisle, the heels of his leather shoes striking the hardwood floor like the tolling of a doomsday bell. His gaze bypassed the judge, bypassed the prosecutor, and locked directly onto the sudden, ashen panic washing over Officer Bradley Jenkins' face. The game was concluded. The predator had just been confined in a cage with a monster. The silence in the Oakage Municipal Courtroom was absolute, a heavy, suffocating shroud that extinguished the localized hubris of the room. Every eye was fixed upon the imposing figure of Special Agent Nathaniel Hayes. He did not hurry. He did not shout. His measured, deliberate steps echoed like a gavel striking a block, signaling the end of an era in this small, corrupt jurisdiction. Judge Harrison Caldwell recovering from the initial shock of the interruption, banged his wooden gavel with frantic, uncoordinated strikes. "Order! Order in this court! Who do you believe you are, barging into my courtroom? Bailiff, remove these men immediately!" The two local bailiffs, elderly men accustomed to managing minor traffic offenders, took one look at the tactical attire and the prominent FBI badges of the men flanking Nathaniel, and wisely opted to remain rooted to the spot. Nathaniel reached the wooden gate separating the gallery from the well of the court. He pushed it open with a smooth, forceful motion and stepped inside. He completely disregarded Prosecutor Harding, who was suddenly perspiring profusely, and walked directly towards the defense table. "Mr. Flynn," Nathaniel stated, his voice a low, commanding baritone that reached every corner of the room. "You are relieved. I will be speaking on behalf of my father." Gregory Flynn, the overworked public defender, practically dissolved back into his chair, his eyes wide. Theodore Hayes looked up. The bruised, exhausted features of the 72-year-old grandfather shifted into an expression of profound, quiet pride. He had not wished to burden his son, but witnessing Nathaniel stand before him, a bastion of federal authority and unyielding justice, brought a sudden, sharp sting of tears to his eyes. "Nathaniel," Theodore whispered. "I've got it from here, Dad," Nathaniel replied softly, placing a large, reassuring hand on his father's frail shoulder. Nathaniel then turned to face the bench, his demeanor instantly transforming from a protective son to a predatory federal investigator. He reached into his breast pocket and produced a thick, sealed envelope, slapping it onto the prosecutor's table with a resounding thwack. "Your Honor," Nathaniel commenced, his tone devoid of any deference to the local judge, "I am Supervisory Special Agent Nathaniel Hayes of the Federal Bureau of Investigation Public Corruption Unit. Accompanying me is Eleanor Sterling, Special Litigation Counsel for the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division." A polished, severe-looking woman in her 50s stepped forward from Nathaniel's flank, flashing federal credentials that caused Judge Caldwell to pale. "Agent Hayes," Judge Caldwell stammered, his bravado crumbling. "This is a state proceeding. You have no jurisdiction to interrupt a trial in progress." "I am not interrupting, Judge Caldwell. I am terminating," Nathaniel corrected, his eyes locking onto the trembling magistrate. "As of 0800 hours this morning, the United States Department of Justice has officially assumed jurisdiction over this matter under Title 18, United States Code, Section 242, Deprivation of Rights under Color of Law. Furthermore, the FBI has secured a federal warrant for the immediate cessation of this malicious prosecution." Prosecutor Harding leaped to his feet, his voice cracking. "Objection! This is outrageous. We have sworn testimony from a decorated officer." "You have perjury," Eleanor Sterling interjected, her voice slicing through the room like a scalpel. She unclasped her briefcase. "You have a fabricated police report, a coerced arrest, and an active conspiracy to deny a United States citizen his civil rights." At the prosecution table, Officer Bradley Jenkins was experiencing a catastrophic physical reaction. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. The smirk had been utterly erased from his face, replaced by the ashen pallor of a man realizing he was standing on a trapdoor. He looked around the room, desperate for an exit, but two federal agents had already moved to secure the rear doors. "Your Honor," Sterling continued, "we have evidence that not only contradicts Officer Jenkins' sworn testimony, but proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that he committed unprovoked felony assault." "Evidence?" Caldwell croaked. "What evidence?" Nathaniel turned to the gallery. "Miss Bennett, if you please." Chloe Bennett, trembling but fortified by the presence of the FBI, walked up the aisle. She handed a flash drive to one of the federal agents, who immediately plugged it into the courtroom's digital projector system, overriding the local feed. Officer Jenkins testified under oath less than 10 minutes ago that my father adopted a fighting stance and that he never saw a wallet until after the assault. Nathaniel declared, his gaze fixed intently on Jenkins. Let's see if the recording corroborates your narrative. The expansive display positioned above the jury box illuminated. The high-definition footage, meticulously refined and augmented by the FBI's specialized cyber forensics unit, commenced playback. The entire courtroom fell into a state of profound, horrified stillness. They witnessed the tranquil, deserted thoroughfare. They observed the police cruiser abruptly ascend the sidewalk. They heard Jenkins' increasingly belligerent and escalating tone, and then, with startling clarity, they saw the worn wallet dislodge itself from Theodore's gnarled fingers. They saw the elderly gentleman stoop to retrieve it. There was no sudden lunge. There was no defensive posture. There was only a frail grandfather attempting to reclaim his belongings. And then, the impact. The sickening, brutal sound of Jenkins striking Theodore reverberated through the courtroom's audio system, immediately followed by the visual of the aged man collapsing onto the asphalt. Exclamations of shock rippled through the spectators. Judge Caldwell receded into his leather seat, his countenance paling dramatically. Prosecutor Harding physically distanced himself from Jenkins as if the compromised officer had suddenly contracted a severe contagion. But that is not the entirety of the account, Nathaniel continued, his voice deepening significantly, imbued with a chilling resolve. Officer Jenkins had presumed a level of cunning. He had neglected to activate his chest-mounted body camera. He mistakenly believed this oversight offered him protection. However, he had overlooked the fact that his patrol vehicle's forward-facing camera operated on a continuous recording loop. Nathaniel gestured towards the agent monitoring a laptop. The screen bifurcated. The newly displayed footage emanated from the cruiser's dashboard camera. It presented the assault from an alternate perspective, and critically, it captured the audio from within the vehicle following the apprehension. The audio crackled. Then Jenkins' voice filled the chamber, laced with amusement, as he communicated via his police radio to the desk sergeant. "Yeah, Paulson, I've got a lively one here. The old fellow got a bit too talkative, had to lay him down on the pavement. I'll document it as resisting arrest. You know the procedure. Ensure the holding cell cameras are on the fritz tonight." The collective inhalation in the room was palpable. This was the irrefutable proof. It transcended a mere violent encounter. It revealed a calculated, institutionalized deception. "Officer Jenkins," Nathaniel stated, pivoting to face the man who had brutalized his father, "you pledged an oath to uphold and protect. Instead, you weaponized your authority to intimidate the defenseless. You presumed that because my father was elderly, because he was of color, and because you wore a uniform, he was insignificant, that he was invisible." Nathaniel advanced deliberately towards the prosecution's table. Jenkins recoiled, his hands visibly trembling. "You were mistaken," Nathaniel whispered, his voice resonating with immense gravity. "He is my father, and I represent the Federal Bureau of Investigation." Eleanor Sterling did not wait for the dashcam footage to conclude before directing her steely gaze back to the bench. "Judge Caldwell," she announced, her tone unwavering, "the Department of Justice formally requests the immediate and with prejudice dismissal of all local charges against Theodore Hayes." Judge Caldwell, the specter of his judicial career flashing before his eyes, brought his gavel down with such force that the wooden handle fractured. "Case dismissed. Mr. Hayes is completely exonerated and free to depart." However, the proceedings of justice were far from concluded. Nathaniel turned to his team. "Agent Brooks, place him under arrest." Bradley Jenkins scrabbled backward, his chair emitting a harsh shriek against the polished hardwood floor. "Wait, I require PBA representation. You cannot proceed with this." "Save that plea for the federal magistrate," Agent Brooks interjected, securing Jenkins's wrist and applying it behind his back with the same precise, unemotional force Jenkins had employed on Theodore. The metallic clink and ratcheting of federal handcuffs echoed through the stunned gallery. "Bradley Jenkins," Nathaniel stated, his voice dropping to a chillingly controlled level. "You are under arrest for federal civil rights violations, felony assault under color of law, and perjury. Your badge is now federal property." As Jenkins was escorted out, he endured a mortifying walk of shame down the central aisle of the very courtroom he had once dominated. His face was devoid of its former arrogant flush. He was no longer a perpetrator. He was simply another federal detainee. The scales of consequence had swung with profound impact. Within a single day, a convoy of black SUVs converged upon the 42nd Precinct. FBI technicians secured servers, systematically searched lockers, and gathered documentation of decades of suppressed excessive force complaints. The corrupt framework crumbled overnight. Desk Sergeant Polson was indicted for falsifying evidence. The precinct captain, Richard Gable, was compelled into ignominious early retirement and faced federal charges for obstruction of justice. Even prosecutor Thomas Harding found himself embroiled in a devastating state bar investigation that permanently concluded his legal career. The Department of Justice imposed a stringent federal consent decree upon the entire Oak Ridge Police Department, systematically eradicating the ingrained institutional corruption. Concurrently, Theodore Hayes refused to remain a passive victim. Represented by the esteemed civil rights legal firm, Preston and Sterling, Theodore initiated a substantial federal lawsuit against the municipality. Confronted with the DOJ's incontrovertible video evidence, the city council capitulated and reached an out-of-court settlement for an unprecedented $8.5 million. However, Theodore, a history educator who had dedicated his life to community betterment, did not retreat to a life of quiet repose. He acquired a derelict commercial property in Oak Ridge's most disadvantaged district. Following a year of extensive reconstruction, he unveiled the Hayes Legal Defense and Youth Center, a cutting-edge establishment offering pro bono legal advocacy and after-school mentorship for at-risk youth. On the occasion of the inaugural ceremony, Theodore addressed the assembled crowd. His gait remained altered, a perpetual physical testament to that humid evening, yet his spirit remained indomitable. He surveyed the jubilant gathering, his gaze alighting upon Chloe Bennett, whose university tuition he had discreetly funded in its entirety, and his son Nathaniel standing proudly in the front row. "They tell us the arc of the moral universe is long," Theodore's resonant voice boomed through the loudspeakers, "and at times, when you are pressed against the cold asphalt, it feels as though it will never bend towards justice. But it does. It bends because we steadfastly refuse to be defeated." 300 meters away, within the stark concrete confines of the United States Penitentiary in Atlanta, federal inmate number 8849120054 sat in his cell. Bradley Jenkins, stripped of his uniform, his pension, and his unwarranted sense of superiority, stared at the floor. He was serving a mandatory 12-year sentence, finally comprehending the true, crushing burden of accountability. This compelling narrative serves as a profound illustration that unchecked authority inevitably encounters its reckoning. Retribution rarely overlooks its target, particularly when justice is administered under a federal mandate. If this account of unequivocal triumph and systemic redress has resonated with you, please signify your approval by liking this video, sharing your reflections on Officer Jenkins' fate in the comments section, distributing it to friends to amplify awareness, and subscribing for more compelling real-life narratives.